excited because I'm not sure how many people have read the book. I just finished it last night, and it was a page turner. And before I get into gushing about the book, I just want to start off about asking what was the impetus for you writing it. And the book you mentioned that there were times in medical school and in your residency training that you didn't speak up in certain moments because you didn't want to be, quote, racially paranoid, or at least perceived that way. So what is it at this point in your career that made you decide to write the book?
Yeah, so there's a lot in the book that's not necessarily like putting me in the most flattering light. I'm really honest about things, and things that maybe I should have done differently, would have done different looking back on it. But I really wanted to I really enjoy medical stories, books written by doctors. But it was like there was something missing. I read so many books on the subject. So few really gave voice to the experience that I had. And so that really is in two different ways. So one is just the perspective of what it's like to be a black man, young black man in America, the experience of what it's like being in medical school, going through the training process, how it's so much different than it was for so many of my other colleagues. And then there's also the other voice about the experience of African American patients, problems that we have in our community. And it's like that those stories just weren't being told. People were just it's talked about in sort of a scientific way and research way, but not really in a sort of a human way. There's real people, real problems. So I really wanted to just give voice, to this. And so that was really how it all started. But I got to tell you, I really didn't imagine the kind of reception that it's gotten. When I tried to get the book published initially, I got some really, it wasn't a lot of interest, honestly. And one publisher actually, there were several publishers who were like, wow, this is something new I've never heard of. I didn't know there were any differences at all. And so it was amazing, so there was that standpoint, there's a lack of sort of awareness. These are really educated people who just have no awareness of this whole other sort of part of the world. And so that was one aspect, but then another, but they still weren't interested in the book necessarily. And then there was another publisher, I won't name this person, but they were like, well, isn't it really just kind of all the fault of they basically said it's really all the fault of the black community why you have health problems. It's like, wow, I don't think this is going to work out. Yeah, and so it was a lot of pushback, and so it was really surprising that I finally did get someone who was interested and sort of understood where I was coming from. Really only one person out of about 15 or 20 who really had any idea what I was really trying to accomplish with this book. And even once I got that, I still was thinking there would be sort of a small audience, and I really wasn't envisioning sort of the attention that the book has gotten. So I'm certainly grateful for it, but I'm still trying to make sense of all of it. So that's kind of where it was. Really, the whole thing started. I just really wanted to give a voice, to these really important issues that I lived and breathed my whole life.
Okay.
Oh, you were going to do this training?
I know.
Yeah. That'll work.
I was going to turn my microphone back on when you were talking, but then if it squeaked, it would just been bad. So, we have a picture of where you are now, and how it got published. But let's start in medical school, where most of the crowd is in the midst of maneuvering right now. How many medical students are here today? Yay! And we also have some other grad students, so dental students. There we go. Any pharmacy or undergrads? Yeah, great. And then who am I forgetting? PhDs. Nice. Okay. And everyone else. All the professors,
Mommies and daddies.
Sorry?
Mommies and daddies.
Mommies and daddies. Yes. Thank you. Okay, and aunties. So in chapter 1, you talked about Admitted Students Day at Duke. I think that's what it was. And you said, Black medical students, resident doctors, and faculty all descended upon us to offer assurance that we would not be racially isolated. And I guess writing, in retrospect, you're looking back and realizing or recognizing that they were there to make you feel supported as medical students of color, Black medical students. But I'm wondering if that was actually the case. When you met the professor who, upon entering back in the classroom after you'd been sitting in lecture, and he asked, are you here to fix the lights? How did you find that you had anyone to turn to, all those people who descended upon you to make you feel like you weren't racially isolated?
Yes, so what I was actually referring to is the second, they call those second look weekends. I'm not sure if they still call that now. So that's when you get to the school, and they'd have these events where they'd be set up just for the African American students who got to the schools. And they would basically get all the sort of the faculty, black faculty, members sort of come out and try and assure you things would be okay if you got there. So I think it's kind of helpful to know a little bit about my background. So I'm actually from the Washington, D.C. area. I'm from a very working class, kind of lower working class background. Dad didn't go to college, didn't finish high school actually. Grew up in sort of the South, and my parents were about 80 years old, in the South, in sort of the town of segregation, really grew up really hard. My mom was in the D.C. area, single mom family, really had it hard as well. And so the area we grew up in, there were not a lot of options as far as a lot of models for black men succeeding. I mean, that sort of was the way in which I kind of, the environment I grew up in. So when I got to a place like Duke, it was a really very different thing. I turn this way, this guy, his dad is the head of the radiology department, this guy's dad is this guy's mom is that. And it was so I was already kind of feeling a little bit, like, I'm not sure how I'm going to fit into this place that I'm here. And so it was already that kind of a thing circulating in the back of my mind. So she mentioned this anecdote. This sort of like the first chapter of the book, where there's this incident with a professor. This is like the first month of medical school. About a month into medical school. And so it's a break between classes. You go out to the class, and then I'm coming back into the classroom after the break. And the professor, he comes across, basically really walks across, so he sort of sees me and does a beeline towards me all the way across the classroom, and he confronts me. And, he said, are you here to fix the lights? And he was pretty angry. It wasn't just like and so I said no, but he wouldn't let it go. And he's like, I called about this, why haven't you done it? So it was like, he really was this really sort of harsh, really bad, mistaken identity kind of deal. But then when I said, the sad part was that I kind of looked at myself and think, well, did I do something wrong? Why is he coming at me like this? What's wrong? What was the situation? That's a really sad thing, but that was sort of the sort of mental thing that I was kind of going through at the time. But then I got angry afterwards, and I was like, no, of course I'm not. Why are you doing this? And then he's like, well, if you're not here for his life, then why are you here in my class? And so that was sort of like this really kind of harsh sort of confrontation that sort of set this sort of framework for my experience, as a first year student. So the question was, what do you do with that, right? So, you go through all this mental stuff, and like go back and forth. Like, if I go and talk to someone about it, are they going to understand it? Are they going to know where I'm coming from? Are they going to think I'm trying to make something up out of nothing? Who do I talk to? I really wasn't sure. I guess to answer your question, I guess I kind of felt like there wasn't at the time anyone I could really talk to about it. Looking back, I probably could have, but it was sort of that was sort of the way that I felt. So I guess it didn't meet my expectation from the very beginning. That was sort of the setup for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question, this is one of our first questions from our audience members. So we asked them an RSVP form for people to submit questions, and so I've incorporated your questions into this. Audience participation, and by way of me. And the first question is actually from one of my classmates, and she wanted to know what are the ways that that white or non-black medical students can support black medical students or students of color and join the fight overall to address diversity in the healthcare field and medical school, et cetera. What is it that they can do to join the movement and not seem as if they're culturally appropriating things and stuff like that?
That's a good question. I think, and I'm going to probably get some folks away to see if they can help me out with that, but I think a couple things. I think one is just, just knowing, just trying to, there's so many scenarios where I was involved in where people just were, I think they would stereotype me. How can I say this in a way that's going to make sense? Just trying to get to know your African American colleagues and not make these assumptions about us, and I think the same is true for my end, because there are things that I learned about some of my way. I have my own preconceptions about them, and sort of reaching across and trying to really understand people. And I think that's probably the main thing that they can do as white students. Let me come back to that. So I don't think my email was down this morning, so I didn't get a chance to look at these questions to prepare. So I'm kind of flying off the cuff. What do you think, Dr. Bray? I'm going to ask you. What do you think? So whenever I get stuck, I'm like,
Yeah, I think what you stated is well. You know, that's what you need to do. Is the one thing so in this society we assimilate, and assimilation is usually from the culture that is coming in to the majority culture. Assimilation is always one direction. I think what has to happen is you have to learn how to assimilate back.
yes, exactly.
And spend your time, because you know, oftentimes when we used to protest back in the '80s, the question was, you know, how can I get to know? How can I get to know? Well, read. It's like we had to read and come and then integrate ourselves into your culture. You need to read about our culture and integrate yourselves into us. And though you won't have the same shared experiences, at least maybe at some point in time you'll have some epiphanies to help you understand how they are walking in their shoes as opposed to how you walk in yours. And that's really what I would say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so one of the problems with the way things are being taught in med school is that when you have these discussions about race, this is how it was back when I was going through it. They would have it for like, they have one day, and this would be like, let's talk about race day. Yeah, I mean, that's what it was. And it was, you know, it's basically worthless in a way, you know, because, you know, these are subjects that need to be integrated and talked about throughout the whole, you know, medical school curriculum. I mean, it's not, you can't just say all of that stuff up and then just put it in for one day. You know, I would just hate how, you know, we would talk about, you learn about all this disease, you learn about all the different types of medical problems, and they'd always say, well, this disease is more common in black people do worse who get this disease. And then they would just leave it there. There'd be no discussion about why, what can you do about it. It was just like, that was it. And so and it was so unsatisfying for me. And it was really, because it not only was affecting me as a black person, but I mean, these are issues that I was dealing with in my own family. I was dealing with myself. As a first-year student, I got diagnosed with high blood pressure, and it was high, and it was also went to the doctor. I can tell you the story in more detail, but had signs of some early kidney problems. I mean, it was really serious stuff for a first-year medical student to be thinking about and dealing with. And again, these professors were just saying, well, you know, this is just. And so then one day I tried to talk to a professor about these problems. Like, well, you know, I was really like, why are we? You mentioned that this is all worse in black people. What is this all about? And it's just the way it is. I mean, it's like, well, you know, why can't we have some kind of discussion about that? And it was so unsatisfying. And then they just save everything for this like one thing at the end of the year. Let's talk about race day. And so it's just so unsatisfying. So I think that's a huge thing that needs to be changed, for sure. Yeah, no doubt about that. I hope it's not. I hope it's getting better in that way. I don't see a lot of encouragement.
Now that I have the mic, I'll comment. Well, my next question, you kind of went into it because actually we've been having discussions and we are planning ways that we can talk to our professors and administrators about just what you said about incorporating Let's Talk About Race Day into just how we're taught in the science curriculum, not as a separate course in our education. But that's awkward sometimes. And you talk about that in your book in the chapter Baby Mamas, which I think might have been my favorite chapter. And not because of the name. No, I thought it was appropriate. But you talked about, you know, you kind of put us on Front Street a little bit. Like you said that black women, that black babies are born 70% of the time to unmarried women. You also talked about a patient in particular who, I think it may even be over 70%, but at the time you wrote it was. And you talked about a patient who would become pregnant and she and her mom would have to take care of the baby because the dad wasn't in the picture, and you felt angry about this black man who was kind of, you know, giving you a bad reputation or representing to, maybe it was changing the way that white people and your white colleagues were interpreting or looking at you because, well, here's another black person in a broken family who's having a baby out of wedlock and things like that. So how do you approach those conversations and talk about what needs to be brought up about why it may be that the dad wasn't in the picture, or that African American men are in the closet and down low or whatever it might be, and putting other people at risk for HIV and other conditions, things like that? How do you talk about those things openly without being awkward?
Yes, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, these are, you know, and these issues are issues that I experienced within my own family. I mean, these aren't like, you know, I'm not someone who's sort of like standing up on high, sort of, you know, judging other people. I mean, that is certainly not or where I'm coming from. These are real issues, but I think we have to talk about, it's a hard conversation for sure. But the equally hard conversation is talking about sort of the past and about all the sort of things that have happened in our society that have sort of helped to break down our family, all of the structural issues, the segregation, and all the way back. So I think having these conversations are really important because what I found in medical school, I went to medical school sort of in an idealistic way that, it's all objective, it's science, science and math, everything's objective and it's just going to be clean. And I was really naive looking back on it. You find how so much of, and some of you guys have probably already seen this, you get out there, so much of it is influenced by things that have nothing to do with sort of the science and the biology of things. And things are so complicated. And we have to really, this is so important. I mean, you can know all the stuff in the world, all the medicine in the world, but if you can't relate to the person, you don't understand where they're coming from, you don't understand the history, these things, you can't deliver the care that people really need. So I think that was the lesson I really learned from that. I was worried about that, like what kind of pushback I would get. But I think if people understand, they know where I'm coming from, they're coming from a place of love, and I think that people really understand that. I think that it's really, I think it does more good. I think because if you don't acknowledge things, you can't really address them. And that's sort of how I see it. Yeah.
So a two-part question.
I tell you, I got kind of. Yeah, she did ask really good questions. I'm kind of like, I need to keep this microphone because I've been on a lot of, not to sort of, I'm not trying to toot my horn, but I've been on a lot of radio interviews, a lot of TV interviews, those sorts of things, and very few people have asked these kinds of really insightful, questions. I mean, there's scratching the surface. You're really getting to the meat of it. Maybe you got another feature. I'm feeling like a little sweat. I need my water bottle later.
And the next two questions are actually from the audience, so they definitely helped me seem eloquent. We talked about what non-minorities or maybe even non-underrepresented people in medicine's obligations are to address or kind of start discussions about diversity in medicine. But what are our obligations as Black medical students and Black physicians? And what is, actually I'll stop there and I'll go to the second question when we're done. What are our obligations as Black students and Black physicians?
That's a question that kind of weaves throughout the whole entire book. One of the realities is that often I was they're the numbers, right? So about 13% of the population is African American, something like that. And among physicians, in North Carolina, it's like 22% African American. In Durham, it's like 40-45% African American. Among physicians, it's like 4% are African American. Also, so many times in training, I found myself being like one of the only African American people, doctors, happen all the time. I'm in psychiatry. During the time I was there, I was the only African American resident for much of the time, the only Black man for sure. And you get so many requests from patients. They want to see an African American provider. I'm one person. There's this huge clinic full of patients, and so that question always comes up. And where's my obligation? Where does it begin and end? How much can I do? And so it's a constant sort of juggling act. It is, because there's a department that really feels a really strong desire and commitment to reach out, to be able to connect with people in ways that some of our other colleagues can't or don't want to, or whatever may be the case. And to also be an example, to try to be an example for people to aspire to. Because when I was growing up, I had never seen a Black doctor until I was in college. other than like on TV, but like in real life, face to face. So the idea of growing up and being in a community and being a doctor would have just been unimaginable for me as a 12 or 14-year-old person. Like, I'd never seen anyone in that position. So I think being able to see people who look like you doing things that it sort of expands your horizons. So I think that's just a really important piece of what I hope to do with this book as well.
Thanks, you have to get it up. Since you touched on psychiatry, I don't think I caught in the book why or how you decided on psychiatry as the specialty for you, especially considering that among the African American community, we're kind of notorious for not seeking medical help for psychiatric or psychological conditions. So how did that happen?
So when I started medical school, I thought I was going to be orthopedic surgeon or a cardiologist, because I played a lot of sports, had a lot of sports injuries, saw some orthopedic surgeons. And then in college, I worked with the researcher I did was with a cardiologist, an African-American guy, and he was in the NIH, and he trained at Johns Hopkins. And so those are the sort of the role models of people that I had. And that's what I thought I was going to do. And I actually started my training in internal medicine, thinking I was still going to do the cardiology path. I didn't really like psychiatry much in medical school. It seemed kind of weird. So I said, no, I don't think this is for me. I was at a state hospital. And then in the 4th year of medical school, I had like a block of time I had to fill, and that was one of the only rotations I could do was another psychiatry elective. And that experience was, it was decent. It wasn't like I was sold on it, but it was like, oh, this is not as bad as I thought it was. But in the intern year, I kind of just started to feel like my strengths were really better. I was really enjoying the social history part of learning about people. Where that part appealed to me more than sort of the managing heart failure, that sort of thing, managing chest pain kind of thing. And when I told my parents, my family, this goes back to the question about the community. They're like, what happened to you? You sent you to medical school, and you're the first person in our family, and all this stuff, and psychiatry. And so this is one of the, this is the truth. So their honest impression of that was that psychiatry was like something that white people did. I mean, that was basically what they said. This is something, it's a luxury that you can see as psychiatrists. We have this. A couple things, so like mom is sort of like this idea that, we have this resilience, you think about all the things that black people have gone through and suffered through and dealt with and come out on the other end. And then there's also like this idea that my mom's really very active in the church, and that's the way that you sort of deal with these issues. So the idea of sort of this traditional mental health on the couch, taking meds, all that stuff, that's crazy. And so there's certainly that perception, and it's something that I've seen, So for me, but the interesting thing about being a psychiatrist though is that when you get into the field, first of all, there's so many layers to that, because when they teach you in psychiatry or race, they teach you that African Americans don't have mental health problems, or they're less likely to have mental health problems, which is garbage. I mean, it is. But this is what they actually are teaching you and saying that, well, black people are, so if you're a doctor and you go into the perspective of the patient, and you believe that, that's going to affect how you interpret whatever that patient is giving. If you believe black people can't be depressed, then you're gonna not see that or ignore it. And so that's a real issue. That's a real issue that I see in psychiatry. Another issue, of course, is the stigma in the patients and not wanting to engage in mental health. And so I think being an African American provider, I mean, I've had so many patients say, "Wow, you're the first black psychiatrist I've ever seen, and this is such a great experience to have." So I mean, that's the other side to that. But the other piece to psychiatry, the book is mostly about medicine, like general medicine, primary care, and all of the health disparities and problems that come from that realm of life, of medicine. The truth is that in mental health it's even worse. So anything that you see in the general medicine world is just amplified. The different types of care that people get, I mean, it's hard to believe. I mean, you see someone, I would see like two people with the same problem. One would have insurance and was white and came from a middle class background, and one was black, uninsured, and a different type of treatment that the people got. You just can't believe it. I mean, I guess you can believe it, but it's just even worse. It's even more stark than anything that you see. I saw in the other medical fields. So there's a huge need for people to be active and address this within the black community, this mental health part. It's a huge thing. The stigma that needs to be dealt with. It's a huge need for people, like me to be in this field. So I tell my mom that, and I think she's finally coming around.
What do you think, audience question, what do you think would be the most, or one of the most effective interventions to increase trust in the medical profession among the African American community, or medical professionals among the African American community?
So you're saying that the medical community the African community doesn't trust the medical community a lot, and how do you work with that, right? Yeah, I mean, so you have to acknowledge. So if there's I've been in some discussions with people. You have to sort of acknowledge the history or what's happened in the past. And so I've been in discussions with people where these are doctors. One of the dangerous kinds of doctors, you're smart and you feel like you're not prone to being biased because you're biased because you're smart, and that's for people who are not intelligent, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes I've seen people get really defensive about these things. And so one time I was trying to talk about things that happened in the past and how this might be, things like, there are all sorts of things. I mean, Duke was segregated hospital until 1965. Obviously the Tuskegee experiment was occurring during this time from the 40s to 1972. And this doctor just sort of was dismissed, oh, well, that's a long time ago. Do you think the patients even know about this stuff? Like, of course if they don't know the specifics of that study, they certainly know about this history, to various degrees. And so I think doctors have to be able to understand and meet people, really be able to meet people where they are and to understand these communities, understand the history, and not sort of think that everything is sort of ancient history, and understand that the past is still informing the present. And so I think doctors have to do that. So I think it's really being able to reach the communities, and not also just on the hospital terms, but actually getting out into the communities and meeting people, where they are as well. I think that's a huge factor that needs to be done. So I think that's how I answer that.
You mentioned a couple times, I think, in the book, the Bakke Supreme Court case, where the Supreme Court agreed that race quotas are unconstitutional, but that admissions offices could consider race as part of their decision-making in admitting students, medical students, undergraduates, et cetera. And that topic is continuing to resurface this cycle. I think the Supreme Court will be hearing Fisher v. University of Texas again. And I wanted to know how do you respond to people who may misunderstand the importance and the way that affirmative action was created to impact employment, admissions, and things like that, and who just simply refuse to believe that African Americans like you are where you are because you are capable and intelligent, and not because you filled some type of quota.
So is that your question, or is that the audience question? Yeah, so I'm curious I'm going to turn it back. I'm curious to hear what you think about it.
How do I address that? I think I'll give some background. I like your long answers, we give a lot of context.
So I'm a psychiatrist, so
I'm projecting right now? So when I was in graduate school, I participated in an affirmative action, I protested at an affirmative action bake sale where it was in Washington, D.C., but they happened at a few universities across the country that school year. So the group putting on the bake sale would give brownies away to black students, and white students would have to pay like $2 to get the brownie. And they were, I guess, trying to educate the fellow college Republicans or fellow students who came to the bake sale about why affirmative action is a terrible thing, and that it's unfair, and that people are getting in who don't deserve to because they're filling a quota. And I was mostly silent during the protest. I held up a sign, and I stood there and I just listened to what they had to say, because I think one of the most important things is being well-informed before you speak and argue with someone. And so I think one of the best ways to respond is to respond with facts and with evidence that, know the legislation, know its history, whether it's Supreme Court history and common law and things like that, or have personal experiences to reflect on. And that day I was more learning about the other side's perspective and trying to figure out how can you possibly misunderstand that this is not what it's for, but not trying to jump to just yelling or having a productive conversation. So that would be my approach. What's yours?
Yeah, so those guys probably thought they were being really clever too with that whole, I could imagine pat themselves on the back. So I talk about that in the affirmative action, particularly at the beginning of the book, because I face that. I talked a little bit about my background, sort of what we consider underprivileged when you're thinking about a place like Duke for medical school, and I'm sure affirmative action played a role in getting me to how things would get me there at Duke and the scholarship I had and all that. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think what's important is like, you know, what do you do with it, right? So there's this idea that numbers mean everything, but they don't really tell the perspective of what you had to do to get where you are, you know, and sort of the advantages and disadvantages you didn't have. And so I think that people probably too wedded. There's no doubt that they're definitely too wedded to that. Now I've been on the admissions committee work where we've had these really grapple with these discussions and had really tried to. And I would say, Brenda Armstrong, some of you may know her. She's been really wonderful at really helping people to sort of see beyond, these numbers and this game and this sort of obsession that people have with that. It really, and it's a term she uses where it describes as what is the distance you travel to get where you are. And that's really a better, barometer of your future than, a specific number on a test. So I mean, that's one thing that I would, challenge to that. And it's also, there's this whole thing about, well, people always just think, well, would you want to see a doctor who got into medical school because of her actions? It's sort of something that people will commonly say, who are opponents. I think the more important question is, well, how did that person do in medical school, right? It's not, and so, I mean, I think that's the ultimate answer, right? And so, those are the kind of discussions I have with people, on this subject. That's what I would say to them.
Okay, our last question. I'm going to quote your recent Washington Post article. And you said that you are, quote, baffled and disappointed by Ben Carson's new identity as a political provocateur. And I'm sure that you're not alone in this room as someone who looked up to, idolized Ben Carson as, a pioneer in neurosurgery and medicine, and within the Black community especially. So, as medical students, as budding physicians, or even as current physicians, is it wrong or is it unnecessary to idolize people? Do we need idols or do we need mentors? And if we do, what should we be looking for in either of those?
I definitely say mentors more than idols, right? So I don't want anybody here to, not that you would, but I don't want anybody here to idolize me. I'm a real person, real issues. It's really more about mentorship and learning from people who've had experiences. But so as far as speaking to, Dr. Carson, so back, this is 20 years ago now, I was accepted to Johns Hopkins as well, and there was an event where he had at his house where he would bring all the African-American students who were accepted to the house, and then he'd meet with the other. It was an event not too different from something like this in terms of, medical students, residents, faculty, all African-American, and sort of the whole thing was about uplift and feeling positive about the race and that sort of thing. So it's just very different, what you see now seems very different from that situation. I mean, that's probably the most diplomatic way of describing it, and so, yeah. I'll just say that. It's really less about, it's not even so much about the positions as it is the style and sort of and that's sort of been troubling. And maybe it's the nature of the beast in politics. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe it's a part of me that just wanted him to keep his medical identity and not go this other direction. I'm still trying to make sense of all that and try to make sense of that from what I knew 20 years ago. So it's something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. But certainly I don't think we should ever be in the business of idolizing people. When you look at what's happened, you think about Dr. T, Dr. Bill Cosby, and how things have come over there. You should never be just about idolizing people. You should just try and take the best from what they have and apply it to your own life, but don't put people on pedestals like that. So I would say that's certainly the message I would convey. I think it also speaks to this idea that Dr. Carson's like the only African American doctor a lot of people have ever heard of or known about. And it really speaks to this idea that we really need more African American people to get that spotlight, to get that attention. I always struggle with this. It's like this, I was just always go back to the beginning where I grew up. And when I had people on my street, a guy across the street who was incarcerated and he got killed in prison. Another guy was incarcerated for drug trafficking. I mean, that was sort of the environment I grew up in. And I just think about sort of the models of how, like with African American men, you watch the news, you see some guy, they show a picture of somebody in a police block. And then that's the start of the news, and the news ends with the black guys, on the sports highs. And look, I played basketball in high school and college. I love basketball more than probably anybody can possibly love it. But the thing about it is that the only thing you see are people who are criminals or people who are playing sports. That shapes people's perceptions. And I think that comes from the top of society, the expectations that people sort of put in at a lane. This is the lane you travel as a black man. I think it starts at the very top of society, and those things affect how people sort of what they can see and aspire for themselves. And so I think we need to just have more visibility. It's just a huge problem. It's a huge concern. I mean, there's so many folks like this who need to be seen out there. And so I think I encourage all of you folks who are out there to be seen and let these young folks see what you're all doing. I mean, I think there's just so much. I mean, I'm actually a really sort of shy person who likes to keep to this, and I'd be happy just being in front of a computer typing away. But I know it's just an important part for me to be out there, to be visible, and I want all of you folks, to do the same thing. I think it's such an important thing. I really appreciate you guys coming out and listening to me. I do write better. My writing's better than my public speaking, so I hope you, read the book and enjoy it. I mean, there's a lot of real stuff in there. So thank you again.